Welcome to Good Grief, the podcast where resilience meets reality. I'm your host, Dr. Christine Malone. In this podcast, we delve deep into the stories of individuals who've triumphed over tragedy, adversity, and trauma. In every episode, we bring you raw and honest narratives from guests who faced life's most challenging moments head on. Through candid conversations, they share their journeys of resilience, shedding light on the strategies, mindset shifts, and support systems that empowered them to rise above their darkest hours. Join us as we explore the profound depths of human resilience and discover how, even in the face of life's toughest trials, there can be light, growth, and yes, good grief. Okay, listeners, thank you so much for joining me for this episode. I have two guests today that are going to talk about their experience with grief. I have Clarissa and her daughter, Fiona. So Clarissa and Fiona, if you'd like to just tell us a bit about yourselves, and then we'll talk about your experience with your grief.
Hey, thanks so much for having us. So I'm Clarissa, and I'm her daughter Fiona, and together we live in the Boston area. We are a mother-daughter author team, and we've written a new book called Hurt, Help, Hope: A Real Conversation About Teen Grief and Life After Loss. And it's based on the 5 years that we have spent together grieving and growing after the death of my husband and Fiona's dad, Rob, in a hiking accident in 2019.
Right. So obviously that was an unexpected loss. It wasn't, you didn't know it was coming. And obviously I'm looking at how young the two of you are. He must have been incredibly young as well. So tell us a bit about, I know I read on your website, Clarissa, that you were like a homeschool mom and so on and so forth. So kind of how did you get through those first few days, weeks, months? In that role where you're now sole parent to these kids, and taking on the whole role?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think for many people who have experienced unexpected loss, they are thrown for a curveball, just like I was. Like you said, I was a homeschooling mom. I was also working as a communications consultant. So I did that on the side. But suddenly I was thrust into primary breadwinner, solo parent, chief decision maker, only disciplinarian, all of the things. I was solo. And I learned that there was a real difference between being a single mom and being a solo parent. There was no one for me to turn to if I had a question about how to parent my children. And certainly, friends and family are great support. But when you're left as a person who has lost their spouse, you realize how very much alone you are in the world. Rob and I had been married for 17 years. We had 4 children together. And so the first few months after his death were trying to hold together a world that was quickly splintering apart. The news of Rob's death came to us unexpectedly, and so we were forced to make decisions really quickly. Decisions about where we were going to live, how the kids would be schooled, even if we would move to a place that was different, trying to assess our finances, all of the kinds of things that happen for all families when they experience a loss. But because ours was sudden, it was crunched in to a very short amount of time.
Yeah.
And for most folks, they experience loss as a fog. And I think that's kind of a mercy. Our brains can't take in all of the details of our loss when it first happens. And so it becomes a slow drip as grief begins to settle into your life. The shock begins to ebb away. It's almost like Novocaine after you've had a tooth pulled, and you feel numb for a very long time. And as the numbness wears off, you begin to experience an ache that you couldn't have imagined it would be that painful. And so, as the numbness and the brain fog sort of wore off over time, I began to realize that I needed to move beyond just survival mode, keeping us afloat, keeping our heads from going under, and really chart out a course to a life that I could live without a sense of despair, and a life that over time I could learn to love again.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I wrote that down, all that slow drip of grief. I like that metaphor. I know in my own experience and from many people that have lost a spouse that when you have children, especially, you're focusing a lot on them and helping them and how to get them through it. And sometimes we don't really, as that parent, do as much of our own self-care and our own looking into our own grief. So did you kind of experience that too in that time of fog where it's like, I got to make sure the kids are okay. And then suddenly it's like, I got to make sure I'm okay.
Yeah. any single parent learns pretty quickly that self-care in reality means something very different than it does on Instagram. On
Yeah.
Instagram, on social media, self-care means mani-pedis. It means wine nights out with the girls. It means a movie night with a half pint of ice cream. But when you're a single parent, when you are a solo parent, you quickly discover that self-care means a shower 3 times a week.
Yeah.
It means a quiet drive to work without answering the phone or responding to a text at a stoplight. Self care comes in the cracks and in the splinters of time, but that doesn't mean that it is any less rewarding or refreshing. It just becomes very ordinary. And so for me, yeah, learning to experience self care after the loss of my husband, it didn't mean going out for movie dates with friends. I was usually too exhausted for anything social, anyways. It meant quiet times of taking a breath while I was folding laundry, just sitting for a moment and closing my eyes and doing some deep breathing. It meant sneaking into my kids' rooms after they had gone to sleep and just sitting quietly and listening to them breathe and allowing my breath to match theirs and slowly relax. Those kinds of self care were deeply meaningful, even though they're nothing that you would ever see written up in an article in Cosmo about.
Excellent point. Excellent point. Now, Fiona, are you the oldest of the kids in your family?
I am, yes.
So how old were you when your dad died?
I was 14 years old.
14. So
Yeah.
tell us a bit about, kind of how 14-year-old, you find out a parent dies. I mean, I don't know many 14-year-olds who've had that misfortune. But kind of not something you expected, not something you obviously even considered, was that you'd be losing a parent at 14. So kind of how did that first part of the process go for you?
Yeah. As a 14-year-old, I was entering middle school or not entering middle school. I was ending middle school. I was starting high school. I was just in a very different place from even my younger siblings who weren't teenagers yet, who were still in elementary school. So I was in a different place socially. I was in a different place physically from everyone else. And so it was a very different experience for me learning how to navigate making new friends at a new school and just going through all of these normal things that teenagers have to go through anyways as they're changing and growing into the people that they're going to become. But on top of that, I had to grapple with, like, how do I live in this world where suddenly I don't have both of my parents, where I'm unsure about a lot of things. And those are just things that other teenagers don't have to worry about. Um, and so it was hard time to oh, sorry. uh it was a hard time as I was changing going into high school and yeah.
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 And I think one of the things that I watched Fiona do was try to discover her identity
Mm,
in the midst of losing a parent.
yeah.
And adolescence is that time of trying to figure out who you are. And so wanting to be normal is really important for teenagers.
That's
And they're trying to figure out what normal looks like for them. And so while a little child might experience grief as crying or angry feelings and then pop over to play with cars or run outside to play, teenagers, they tend to be more introspective. They spend a
mhm.
lot of time in healthy and sometimes unhealthy brooding. And all of those important thoughts are because they're changing and growing. And so for a teenager, that's a lot of the grief work, is to do that integrative thought work that is actually what adults are doing as well. So they kind of have one foot in childhood, but one
Yeah.
foot in adulthood as well.
That was going to be my next comment, is I think it makes you grow up faster than you would typically grow up, because don't most people do not have a loss at a really young age. I mean, it's not, well, I mean, it happens, but it's not as common when we think of ourselves as, like outliving our children is just blows your mind, or let alone losing a parent when they're so young is makes you think about things that you hadn't considered before. You were thinking about high school and clothes and friends and whatever, right? And all of a sudden it's like, wow, now there's this. Did you find, Fiona, like, and did any of your friends kind of, or even your new friends, did they treat you a little any differently because you had this experience that they'd not had? Was there anything like they don't want to talk about it, or they don't want to mention it, or they don't want to make you sad, or anything like that where you felt like you're treated differently?
So when I got back to school, I went to a very small school, and my classmates had already heard about it, which was a blessing for me because they were already able to like figure out how they felt about it and figure out how they could best help me. Um, so it was a very nice for me to be able to come into an environment that already knew that I didn't have to tell people about it.
Yeah.
Um, but then the second time that I switched schools, um, it was awkward having to tell people and being like, yeah, there's kind of my family doesn't look the way that everyone else's does. Um, but I think that I was able to surround myself with people who knew how to support me and love me the way that I needed.
Yeah.
Um, so I did not have as much of an awkwardness as some people might have
Yeah.
had. But yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think that this kind of loss is surprisingly more common than a lot of people realize. Statistics tell us that 1 in 12 students will lose a parent or a sibling before they turn 18. And so, I mean, that's at least 3 on every school bus.
Yeah.
That's at least 2 kids on every soccer team. That's at least 2 kids in every classroom. And so while there are students who don't understand what it means to lose a loved one, and there are a lot of them,
Sure.
it's surprising in circumstances when you're able to be even a little bit vulnerable about your loss, just to share, hey, my dad died, or my family looks different than other people's families. It's
Mhm.
surprising how many other people have grief adjacent experiences, if not a similar experience, where you can find companionship. And I think for teenagers, that's particularly encouraging when grief can make you feel really alone.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I know when my middle son passed away, my older kids were 7 and 9, and we got them involved in a support group for kids who had a sibling that had passed, which was very helpful because they did feel like it was just that awkward, hey, how many brothers and sisters do you have, or whatever. And then to have even as a mom, when people ask me how many children do you have, it's that awkwardness of how do I describe this without making this just be so awkward and so weird and not make people uncomfortable. One thing I know, it's been 5 years, but one thing I know, and I'll speak to how my daughter is now almost 31. When her dad died, she was only 2. But we've had what I call pockets of grief over the years where, these life events happen, graduation, and for her when she got married, those kinds of things where, I don't have this parent here, kind of, so it kind of comes back to you even more so, even though you've done a lot of healing along the way. So Fiona, have you had anything like that where you've had kind of a day? I mean, I know the Father's Days and the holidays, I know that, but I mean, like one of those pockets where you're like, oh my gosh, I don't have dad here for learning to drive or whatever it might be.
Yeah. I definitely have. Um, Specifically like the week before I graduated, I was really struggling with that, where a lot of other people would have their whole families there and their parents there, and I didn't. Um, but one thing I've come to learn from and accept is that great grief doesn't go away as time goes on. It comes and goes in waves, like
Yeah,
you said, or in pockets of grief. And so, um, even though the wound is still healing, there are still times when it flares up and when it becomes hard again. And so I think that's something that, even though it is hard, it's also something that I kind of treasure, that the love that I have for my dad doesn't just go away as the hurt continues to go away or as the time continues to pass. There are still times when I'm like, I still really miss him. And I think even though that's something that's really hard, like when I get married or when I graduated, um those are times that will be hard, but there are also times that I will treasure and be able to still hold his memory with me.
Yeah.
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 I read something really cool just the other day on social media, and it was this. Because of what I post, that must be why I get all these things about grief all the time. But it was something about when you're grieving and you have those days that are really, really hard, to think about how much the person that you've lost loved you, and to turn that around and to treat yourself with that same kind of love. So thinking about how much he loved me, and to love myself in the same way. So I found that to be kind of hit me in a way. I was kind of like, oh, I
Yeah.
really like that, because when I personally have my down moments, I have a down moment, and it's like I really need to think about, yes, it's and you made, as the point you just make, is you grieve the things that you loved the most. I mean, obviously our parent, whatever. So that makes perfect sense, along those lines as well. So Clarissa, I know you've written some books on grieving, and so tell us a bit about that. Then I want to talk about the one that you two have written together.
Yeah. Well, after my husband's death, I wrote a book called Beyond the Darkness, a gentle guide for living with grief and thriving after loss, in a strange and perhaps serendipitous twist of fate. My husband, Rob, had actually been a journalist who had written a book called The Art of Dying. Living fully into the life to come. Rob was a journalist who had done a lot of investigative journalism around death with dignity and euthanasia. He had spent time working in a funeral home and as a hospice volunteer. And he just saw that the way that medicalized dying had reshaped our culture was unhealthy for a lot of people. It didn't give us a chance to say goodbye. It didn't give us a chance to really think about the way we wanted to spend our last days, the way we wanted to end our lives. And so he wrote this book to help people as they were walking with a loved one who was dying, or as they were dying themselves, to figure out, how do I want to die? How do I want to experience a good death? And after his death, I thought, hey, we worked on this book together. I edited while he wrote. We as writers, we were always working in tandem for our whole marriage together. And I thought, what a beautiful way to connect with his memory, to extend his legacy, to take that next step and write a book for the people who are left afterwards.
Yeah.
After dying has taken place, what does it look like to grieve in a healthy way and to grow authentically? Because one of the things I often tell folks after they've lost a loved one is that flourishing after loss isn't a possibility. If you want it, it's a probability.
Right.
And so much scientific research tells us that resilience is literally written into our DNA. And there's a lot of language now in grief support and community about sort of embracing the suck, like let it be as bad as it is, and we are all for that. It's a reason why we don't use the words healing and recovery when we talk about grief, because we're aware that grief isn't like a broken leg, that it's not something that ever goes away, and so you learn to live with it like a companion. But I don't believe that that's where the story ends. I really truly believe that science and all of the universe tells us in every way that new life comes after death. We see it on the trees outside in the springtime when the leaves come again. We see it in our body at the cellular level. And so all of nature is telling us that after loss, after suffering, you can live in a way that is deeply satisfying and joyful,
Yeah.
but you got to work for it.
Yeah.
And part of that is the authentic grieving that we really encourage in our work together. And part of it is that slowly, ever so slowly, putting one foot in front of the other, doing the thing that you can do in the space that you can do with the strength that you have, and trusting that those efforts are leading toward a resilient kind of life that you can get excited about. And really, that's the thrust of this new book, Hurt, Help, Hope. I've shared that message with adults. And one of the things that we've seen, particularly in the light of the Surgeon General's research on student mental health, on the loneliness epidemic that's so much a part of our culture, in the wake of COVID deaths that have affected children and teenagers exponentially in the US, a loss that we have never experienced in a young generation like that before. We just felt like we didn't want to leave kids with just sadness. We wanted to show them that authentic sadness coupled with small steps of hopeful action can lead to not only healthy grieving, but really exciting and deeply satisfying growth after they lose a loved one.
Right, right. So, Fiona, do you feel like kind of the same way as mom, where you really got something out of doing this project, where it helped you in some way as well?
Yeah, definitely. Not only has it been amazing to be able to work with my mom on a project, um, but I think we've been able to talk to each other about things that maybe we just wouldn't have even thought to talk about.
Right.
Um, anyways, and yeah, so it's been really amazing to work through this specific project, specifically with our shared loss, and to be able to learn more about each other and to learn more about just the way that teens grieve and how it's just a very different journey. Yeah.
I would imagine parents of teens, or would have also get something from that to really kind of understand, because grief is different for different ages. I mean, little kids, for example, you're telling them things that according to their age level, what can they understand today, what's okay, and so on. When my husband died and my kids were 2 and 4, for example, to try to explain he's gone forever to a 2 and a 4-year-old was very different. So it took us years to get to the point of really having the story, because they couldn't take it at that age. And yeah, so it was kind of one of those, you got to kind of know what to do differently. So I love that you're doing something that's going to be addressing how teens specifically can be helped through the grieving process with their parent, and so on. So aside from that, now I've looked at your website, Clarissa. You do a lot of other things too. So what else are you doing that, kind of along those same lines, where you're reaching out and helping people?
Yeah. Well, I lead support groups for grieving parents, growth groups for widows who are looking to take that next step beyond surviving into thriving again. And, in my own life, I'm working toward that every day myself. We've hit the 5-year mark. And for a lot of people, they would say, you're done, right? You're done grieving. And yet every month, every milestone, it's just a reminder that this is a work of companionship, learning to live with this unwelcome visitor who arrived 5 years ago at our campsite to give us this news and has never left. And one of the things I think that both Fiona and I have experienced as we face that grief day after day is that even as grief brings a lot of sorrow and physical difficulty and pain, relational strain, there are also hidden gifts of wisdom
Yep.
that it offers to us that we realize as time goes by, we never could have learned any other way.
I'm 100% with you. As I shared before we started recording, my whole life changed due to some life-changing experiences, and in a very good way. And I hate to make it sound like I'm thankful, but I am thankful. I'm thankful that my experiences, I am who I am because of what I've been through. And I think I'm okay. So it's, kind of on the same lines, as you wouldn't wish it on someone, but there is, that those gifts, as you put it, that come out of it too. So
Yeah.
go ahead.
Oh,
Oh, along those lines, I think that not only the gifts that you're able to see in your life come from having such a hard loss, but also I have found that being able to share my story with other people is kind of where I'm taking my next step in my grief journey. And so the amazing thing is that while you're grieving and as time goes on, it doesn't have to become only about you and your loss. It can become
Mhm.
about how you can use the struggles and the pain that you've been through to relate to other people who are going through the same thing,
Yeah.
and to be able to lend your wisdom or even just your companionship to those who are going through the same thing.
No, oh, you're so spot on. You're so spot on. So we're going to put a link to your books in the podcast notes when your episode airs, so that listeners can find your all of your books before Clarissa, and as well the two of you written together. So is there anything else you'd like to share though before we end today?
mm. What's one word you would share for a grieving teen?
Ooh. Um, I would, well, it's not one word, but I will say find a community, because one thing that has been very important for me is the community that I have and the people that I've surrounded myself with.
Yeah.
So, like we talked about earlier, find people who are going through the same thing as you. Find people who can just get you and support you in the things that you need. Find a community who will support you, whether it's a sports team or a church group or a school club. Just find people who can be your people, who you know will support you, because losing a parent and grieving can often put you in an island and make you feel very alone. So yeah, I would say find your community.
Find your community. I like that. I like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
How about you,
Grief
Clarissa?
is not a solo journey. It
Right.
doesn't need to be that.
Mhm.
And that goes for parents too. There are a lot of awesome online parenting resources for parents who are helping their kids to grieve. And I think one of the hardest things for me as a mom watching my kids grieve was to realize that I didn't have all the control.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I couldn't predict the outcome. I could only be present with them in the day.
Yeah.
And over time, as you release that need to control, that desire to control, that desire to shelter your child from any other bad thing that could ever possibly happen to them ever again, you realize that releasing your grip on those things that you can't control actually opens your hands so that you're able to receive what that day brings.
Wow.
And that kind of open-handed living is the kind of living that we all actually long to live after loss, a life that is open to possibility, that's able to receive the hard things and also hold joy in the same hand at the same time. Those things are only possible when we unclench our fists and we release that control and trust that walking alongside of our children is the very best parenting we can offer them.
Absolutely. Well, Clarissa and Fiona, I want to thank you both so much for being my guests today. It has been an absolute pleasure chatting with you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Good Grief. We hope that the stories shared today have inspired and empowered you on your own journey of resilience. If you want to dive deeper into the themes of trauma, tragedy, and survival, be sure to check out my memoir, The Day I Became the Spider Killer, a memoir of trauma, tragedy, and survival. In this book, I shared my own raw and honest experiences, offering insights and strategies for overcoming life's toughest challenges. You can purchase the book on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or listen to it on Audible. Your support helps us continue to bring these powerful stories to light and spread a message of hope and resilience. Stay tuned for more incredible stories on our next episode. Until then, remember, even in the face of life's toughest trials, there can be light, growth, and good grief.